It was just a family portrait from 1911. 9 people, arranged in careful rows. A wealthy household, photographed for the record, the way prosperous families did every few years back then. For over a century, this exact photograph sat in a private collection, passed down, occasionally admired, never once looked at closely. Then in 2024, an archivist in Manchester zoomed in on one detail, and what she found is the reason you're watching this video right now. Her name was Eleanor Voss. She specialized in domestic-era photography. Servants, household staff, the invisible people who kept great houses running and rarely made it into history with a name attached. She'd scanned 6 photographs that morning. This was the 7th. A family of 6, seated and standing in a garden. Behind them, almost out of frame, a young woman in a plain dark dress. The household maid. Standard for a photograph like this. Present, but positioned to be forgotten. Exactly what you'd expect. Exactly what everyone assumed for over 100 years. Eleanor zoomed in out of pure habit, just checking for damage before logging the image. Her hands stopped moving. The maid's hand rested at her side. 3rd finger, a ring. At low resolution it looked plain, unremarkable. The kind of detail anyone would scroll past. At full resolution it wasn't a ring at all, not in the way anyone in that garden, in 1911, was ever supposed to understand it. There were numbers engraved into the band, small, precise, deliberately cut, not decorative. Eleanor had catalogued hundreds of servant photographs. She had never seen anything like this, not once, not on any staff member, not in any collection she'd ever touched. This is not a story you've heard before. Historians who've since reviewed this case have said the same thing, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. Why would a housemaid, a woman with no money, no property, nothing legally her own, wear a ring engraved like a government document? That question is what this story answers. And the answer changes everything you think you know about who actually built that family's fortune. Her name was Margaret Doyle. 19 years old, from a small mill town outside Manchester. She entered service at the Ashworth household in 1907, the way thousands of young working-class women did that decade. No formal schooling past 12, no family money, no path forward except a position in someone else's house. The Ashworths were textile wealth. Mr. Charles Ashworth ran a mill that employed hundreds. By 1911, the family was minor local aristocracy. A large house, a staff of 11, a name that meant something in Manchester society. Stay with this for a second, because it matters more than it seems right now. Margaret's official role was scullery maid, then later promoted to lady's maid for the household. Low in the domestic hierarchy. Long hours. Almost no personal time, and even less personal property. But Margaret had something almost no one in that house knew about. A mind for mechanics. Her father had worked in the mill's engineering shop before an accident took his hand in 1905. Margaret, as a girl, had spent hours in that shop, watching him, absorbing more than anyone around her realized a servant's daughter should ever need to know. By the time she entered service at Ashworth House, she understood machinery, looms in particular, in a way most trained engineers of the era didn't. This detail alone won't make sense yet, but remember it. It's the key to everything that comes later in this story. The Ashworth mill, like every textile mill in 1910, had a persistent, dangerous problem. Loom threads snapped constantly under tension, and workers, mostly women and children, had to reach into moving machinery to fix them. Injuries were common. Deaths were not rare. Charles Ashworth wanted a solution. He'd been trying, unsuccessfully, to design a tension-regulating mechanism for 2 years. Margaret, working in his household, overheard dinner conversations about the problem constantly. Engineers visiting the house. Frustrated discussions. Failed prototypes described in detail, right in front of the staff, because nobody thought the staff was listening, or capable of understanding. Nobody thought a maid could understand mechanical tension regulation. That assumption is exactly what makes the next part of this story so difficult for historians to sit with. Margaret understood every word. In early 1910, working alone, in whatever scraps of free time a domestic servant was allowed, she began sketching a solution of her own. She had no formal training, no workshop, no one to ask for help. What she had was a notebook, stolen moments after her duties ended, and a mind that had been quietly solving the exact problem her employer couldn't. By the autumn of that year, she had it, a design that worked, and what she did next is the part of this story nobody, not her descendants, not historians, not anyone, expected to still be provable over a century later. Margaret didn't go to Charles Ashworth with her design, not at first. She understood, better than anyone, what would happen to a servant girl claiming she'd solved a problem 2 trained engineers couldn't. If you think you know where this story goes next, stay with it, because you don't. Not yet. Instead, she waited. In November 1910, Ashworth's engineers presented another failed prototype at dinner. Loudly frustrated, discussing the exact flaw Margaret had already solved months earlier. That night, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She left her notebook, open to the correct diagram, on the desk in the study she cleaned every morning, where Ashworth would find it before his engineers arrived. She never signed it. She never claimed it. She simply left the answer where the right person would see it, and trusted that the truth of the design would speak for itself. It did, just not for her. Charles Ashworth found the notebook the next morning. Historians who've since studied his surviving diaries describe his reaction in his own words: stunned, then electric with excitement, convinced he'd finally cracked the problem himself, after 2 years of failure. He never asked the staff who'd been in that study. He never considered, for a single moment, that the answer might have come from someone other than himself or his engineers. This is the moment everything historians previously believed about the Ashworth family fortune becomes, provably, untrue. Within 6 weeks, Ashworth filed a patent application for a tension-regulating loom mechanism, under his own name, with his own signature, describing an invention he had not designed. The patent was granted in March 1911. It transformed the Ashworth mill's output, cut injury rates dramatically, and was licensed to competing mills across Lancashire within 2 years. It made Charles Ashworth wealthy beyond anything his mill alone could have produced. It is, historians now confirm, the single invention responsible for the majority of the Ashworth family's generational fortune, the fortune that funded that garden, that photograph, that portrait taken just months later. And the woman who actually designed it was standing in the back row of that same photograph, wearing the only proof she had left, disguised as jewelry nobody thought to look at twice. The ring wasn't sentiment. It wasn't decoration. It was Margaret's own patent number, engraved onto a band she wore every day for the rest of her life, carrying the truth on her hand because she had nowhere else safe to carry it. Stay with this story, because what Eleanor Voss found next, buried for over a century, is the part even she didn't expect to survive. Eleanor didn't stop at the photograph. That evening, she pulled the patent number from the ring and searched it against the UK's historical patent archive. Her hands went still for the second time that day. The number matched exactly. Patent number, filing date, description. All of it corresponded precisely to Charles Ashworth's 1911 tension-regulating loom mechanism. But patent numbers aren't randomly assigned to individuals after the fact. They're generated at the moment of filing, tied to the specific application submitted to the patent office. If you're wondering how a housemaid could possibly have a legitimate patent number engraved on her ring, you're asking exactly the right question. Because officially, on paper, she shouldn't have had access to it at all. Eleanor contacted a colleague specializing in Edwardian-era intellectual property law, a historian named Dr. Priya Nair, who agreed to review the case within days. Dr. Nair pulled the original 1911 Patent Office ledger, not the polished, published patent record, but the internal submission log, rarely digitized, rarely examined by anyone outside specialist archives. What she found there is the piece of evidence that changes this entire story. The internal ledger showed 2 submissions on the same date, for the same mechanism. One from Charles Ashworth, and a second, filed 2 days earlier, under the name M. Doyle, quietly rejected on procedural grounds, citing incomplete documentation and lack of a qualified witness signature. Margaret had tried to file it herself first. She knew exactly what she'd built, Dr. Nair said, reviewing the ledger with Eleanor over a video call. She tried to protect it. The system simply wasn't built to let a working-class woman own her own invention, and it made absolutely sure she couldn't. In 1911, married and unmarried working-class women faced enormous legal barriers to filing patents independently, requiring witnesses, fees, and documentation most domestic servants had no access to, no time to gather, and no one willing to formally support. Margaret's rejected application sat in that ledger for over a century, unnoticed, unexamined, exactly 2 pages before Charles Ashworth's successful one. This is the detail that made Eleanor Voss put down her pen and called Dr. Nair back a second time that same night. The rejection notice included one final detail, a witnessing engineer's signature that had approved Margaret's design as technically sound, before procedural rules blocked the filing anyway. That engineer's name was recorded in the ledger, and 3 days after the rejection, that same engineer began working directly for Charles Ashworth. Someone in that mill knew exactly what had happened, and for over 100 years no one said a word. Dr. Nair and Eleanor spent the following weeks tracing every surviving Ashworth household record they could find, looking for anything that might explain what happened to Margaret after the patent was granted to a man who wasn't its inventor. What they found next is the part of this story that turned a mechanical mystery into something far more personal and far harder to read. Margaret remained employed at Ashworth House for 3 more years after the patent's approval, according to household wage ledgers Eleanor located in a regional archive. Her position, her duties, her modest wages, none of it changed. She continued cleaning the study where her own invention had been quietly claimed by the man who employed her every single morning for 3 years. Historians studying this case have called it one of the clearest, most uncomfortable documented examples of servant-class intellectual erasure from the entire Edwardian period, precisely because so much evidence somehow survived to prove it. Eleanor found a single surviving letter from Margaret, written to her younger sister in 1912, held in a family collection donated decades later to a regional archive. Most of the letter was ordinary: weather, wages, news of home. One paragraph was not. "I built something," Margaret wrote. "It works exactly as I knew it would. Mr. Ashworth says it was his idea entirely, and everyone in this house nods along, because that is what everyone always does. I have decided I will not argue with a man who owns the roof over my head. But I have made certain the truth does not disappear completely." That single sentence, "I have made certain the truth does not disappear completely," is the line that will stay with you long after this video ends. Dr. Nair believes this is the exact moment Margaret decided to have the ring engraved, not as jewelry, not as sentiment, but as a permanent physical record of a truth the official system had refused to protect. She couldn't win the legal fight, Dr. Nair said, so she made sure the evidence would outlive everyone who benefited from erasing her. She just didn't know it would take over 100 years for anyone to finally look. Margaret left Ashworth House in 1914, according to household records, for reasons never explained in any surviving document. She married a mechanic named Thomas Riley in 1915 and settled in a small town outside Manchester. She never filed another patent. She never publicly claimed credit for the invention that made another family wealthy for generations. But she wore the truth on her hand for the rest of her life. And that decision is exactly why, over a century later, we're finally telling her story. Eleanor's research might have ended there, a documented injustice, tragic but finished, another name quietly added to history's long list of uncredited inventors. But it didn't end there. And what happened next is the reason this case made international headlines within weeks of publication. Eleanor began searching for living descendants, hoping someone in Margaret's family might know more than the surviving records could tell her. 3 months into that search, she received an email that made her sit back from her desk entirely. It came from a woman named Susan Riley, living in Yorkshire, Margaret Doyle's great-granddaughter. "My grandmother used to talk about a ring," Susan wrote. "She said her mother, Margaret, never took it off. Not once, not ever. Not even when it stopped fitting properly in her final years. We always thought it was just sentimental. We had no idea." Susan agreed to meet with Eleanor and Dr. Nair. She brought with her a small wooden box, inherited from her grandmother, that had sat unopened in a cupboard for over a decade. Inside that box was something neither Eleanor nor Dr. Nair expected to find. Something that would turn this story from a single tragic case into an entirely different scale of injustice. It contained 3 more notebooks. Margaret's own mechanical designs continued in secret for years after leaving Ashworth House. Sketches for improvements to textile machinery, agricultural equipment, even an early design for a safer domestic stove valve. None of them were ever filed. None of them were ever built. Margaret had kept inventing, quietly, for the rest of her life, with no legal path to ever claim any of it as her own. "She never stopped," Susan said, turning through the pages with visibly shaking hands. She just stopped believing anyone would ever let her own what she made. Dr. Nair, reviewing the notebooks, identified at least 2 designs that were later patented independently by other inventors, years after Margaret had already solved the same problems, in her own handwriting, dated and unmistakable. "This isn't just one stolen invention," Dr. Nair said. "This is a woman who may have quietly anticipated multiple mechanical advances of her era, and never once had a system willing to let her claim any of them. If you thought this story was already remarkable, this is the moment historians realized it was so much bigger than anyone initially understood." The findings were published jointly by Eleanor and Dr. Nair in early 2025 through a regional historical and intellectual property journal, a careful, evidence-based account rather than a sensationalized claim. The response was immediate, and it split, almost perfectly, along the same lines this story has followed from the very beginning. Historians specializing in women's labor history called it one of the most significant documented cases of its kind. Physical, dated, corroborated evidence of servant-class intellectual theft, supported by patent ledgers, personal letters, and surviving notebooks spanning decades. Some intellectual property historians were more cautious, noting that proving intent, that Ashworth knowingly and deliberately claimed Margaret's work, rather than genuinely believing it was his own, remained difficult to establish with total certainty from surviving records alone. But even the most cautious voices agreed on one point. The rejected patent application, filed 2 days earlier under Margaret's own name, is very difficult evidence to explain any other way. The Ashworth family's modern descendants, contacted by journalists following the story's publication, responded with what one reporter described as visible, genuine shock. A great-great-grandson of Charles Ashworth issued a public statement acknowledging the research, without disputing its central findings. "Our family's history is not something we can rewrite," the statement read, "but we can, finally, help make sure the right name is attached to it." The family has since funded a scholarship in Margaret Doyle's name, supporting young working-class women pursuing engineering education, the exact path Margaret herself was never permitted to walk. This is the moment the story stopped being only about the past, and started changing something in the present. Susan Riley attended the scholarship's launch in 2025, holding a printed copy of her great-grandmother's ring, magnified large enough for every engraved number to be clearly visible. "She carried the truth on her own hand for over 50 years, Susan said, addressing the small crowd. "Nobody looked closely enough to see it while she was alive. I'm glad the world is finally looking now. And that phrase, 'carried the truth on her own hand,' is about to matter even more than you think." Eleanor returned to the original photograph one more time, months after publication, for reasons she has said she still finds difficult to fully explain. What she found, on this final pass, is the detail that even seasoned researchers didn't expect. The discovery that turned this from a story about theft into a story about quiet, deliberate defiance. She examined, for the first time at extremely high resolution, Margaret's posture in the photograph, the exact position of her hand relative to the rest of the family group. Every other figure in the portrait faced the camera directly, hands at their sides or folded, in the standard formal posture of Edwardian photography. Margaret's hand was different, subtly, deliberately angled, turned just enough that the ring caught the light, positioned in a way that made it, however faintly, visible in the final print. Photographers of that era gave detailed instructions for exactly how servants should stand. Hands still, faces neutral, presence minimized. Margaret's hand position was not an accident. It was a choice. She knew this photograph would survive, Dr. Nair said, when Eleanor showed her the enhanced image. Photographs were expensive, rare, permanent objects in 1911. She understood exactly what she was doing when she turned her hand that particular way. Whether Margaret ever imagined it would take over a century for anyone to notice, no record can say. But the deliberate positioning suggests something historians have come to believe with increasing confidence. She wasn't hoping to be seen by her employer, or by anyone in that garden that day. She was leaving evidence for someone who hadn't been born yet. This detail changed how Eleanor understood everything else in Margaret's story. The notebook left on the desk, the rejected patent filing, the engraved ring worn every day for the rest of her life. And now, finally, a hand deliberately angled toward the light in the one photograph, guaranteed to outlive her. "Every single piece of evidence in this case was placed there on purpose," Eleanor has said in interviews since. Margaret Doyle didn't leave a trail by accident. She built one, piece by piece, because she understood that the truth doesn't have to win immediately. Sometimes it just has to survive long enough to be found. And what that patience actually cost her is the final part of this story, the part that will stay with you longest. Susan Riley, in the months following the scholarship launch, continued digging through her family's remaining papers, hoping to understand more about her great-grandmother's later life. What she found answers the one question everyone watching this video has probably been asking since the very beginning. Did Margaret ever get any justice at all, in her own lifetime? The answer, Susan discovered, was complicated, and quietly, devastatingly human. A diary entry from Margaret's daughter, Susan's grandmother, written decades later, described a memory from childhood. Margaret, in her final years, had shown her the ring, explained what the numbers meant, and made her daughter memorize the story exactly, word for word. "She told me it wasn't for anger," the diary entry read, in Margaret's daughter's own handwriting. "She said knowing the truth was its own kind of ownership, even if the law never agreed. She made me promise to tell my own children, so the ring would always mean something to somebody, even after she was gone." That promise passed silently through 3 generations, mother to daughter, daughter to granddaughter, for over 100 years, until Eleanor Voss finally zoomed in on a photograph nobody had looked at closely in over a century. Margaret Doyle died in 1961, at the age of 69. Her death certificate lists her occupation, plainly, as housewife. No mention of mechanical design. No mention of the invention that transformed an entire industry. No mention of the patent that was never legally hers, though it was, undeniably, her mind that built it. She never got legal justice, Dr. Nair has said, but she got something else. She got certainty. She knew exactly what she'd done, and she made absolutely sure the proof would outlast every person who benefited from denying it. The ring itself has since been donated to a regional museum of industrial history, displayed now beside a full explanation of Margaret's story, the rejected patent, the ledger entry, the notebooks, the photograph, all presented together for the first time. Visitors can now stand exactly where Charles Ashworth once stood, look at the same ring Margaret wore every single day, and understand, in a way an entire century failed to, exactly whose invention actually built that family's fortune. Look at the photograph one final time. 9 people. A wealthy family, proudly posed in their garden. It looks almost exactly the way it did before this story began. But you will never see it the same way again. That young woman in the back row isn't a forgotten servant, positioned to be overlooked. She is the reason that garden, that house, that entire family's fortune existed at all. Her hand, deliberately angled toward the light, carried the one piece of proof the world refused to give her any other way to keep. Margaret Doyle spent her whole life understood by almost no one, dismissed by the family she served, erased by the legal system that should have protected her, remembered by history only as the maid, in a photograph that was never really about the family standing in front of her at all. Eleanor Voss still returns to this case more than any other she's worked on. She has said, in her most recent interview, that it changed how she looks at every archive photograph since. "We spend so much energy studying the people history chose to remember," she said. "This case taught me the real work is in the people history tried to forget, and in trusting that some of them were clever enough to make sure forgetting was never actually possible. Margaret Doyle never filed a successful patent, never received a royalty, never saw her name attached, in her own lifetime, to the invention that made another family wealthy for generations, but she made absolutely certain that one day someone would look closely enough to find the truth. And today, you are the reason that promise was finally kept." What would you have done, in her position, with no power, no legal protection, and only one small, quiet way left to make sure the truth survived? If stories like Margaret's, the ones the world tried hardest to erase, deserve to be found and told properly, subscribe, and let's keep looking closely at the hands history told us not to notice.